if we fix the problems with phonics instruction, everything will be okay. So some researchers have looked at what happens with these early literacy reforms that are things like dyslexia screening or training teachers in foundational reading skills. So things that are really focused on those foundational reading skills. And they have found, so this is from a study of, I think it was 42 states and maybe the District of Columbia that had adopted some kind of early literacy policy related to basically to decoding instruction. And virtually every state has now adopted some policy or legislation related to that. So what these researchers found was that, yes, fixing the phonics problem does get you a bump in reading test scores in third grade, fourth grade, to some extent fifth grade, but then the bump fades out and it's like you never did it. The key finding, as you can see here, is that adopting any literacy policy is going to improve elementary students' reading achievement on these high stakes tests, but those effects fade out by middle school. So why would that be? Well, one possibility is that as readers encounter more multisyllabic words, they have more trouble sounding them out. And we do need to address that. But experts agree that what becomes really important as grade levels go up is not just decoding ability, but also comprehension ability. So that suggests that maybe something has been missing from our approach to comprehension. Another problem, I mean, this is a problem because we don't just want third graders who can ace reading tests. We want this to continue. And another problem is that kids are not reading for fun as much as they used to. And you may be aware of this anecdotally, but we also do have data, quantitative data on this. The NAEP, which tests kids in reading and math every 2 years, also sometimes asks kids about their reading habits. And last year, they found that only 14% of 13-year-olds in the US read for fun almost every day, which is down significantly. If you go back to 1984, 35% said that. And the other side of that coin is that 31% last year said they never or hardly ever read for fun. And that's up significantly. I mean, in 1984, that was only 8%. And this is not just reading books, this is reading anything. And this is a problem as well. We know that, I mean, first of all, we don't want kids to just read what they have to for school. We want them to become lifelong readers, to enjoy reading. And we also know that reading for pleasure, being an avid reader, is correlated with all sorts of good outcomes. So there are obviously many causes, including the prevalence of screens, et cetera, but maybe this too has something to do with our approach to reading comprehension. So let's take a look at that not reading for pleasure problem. This is a fairly typical lesson in the comprehension skill of distinguishing between literal and non-literal language. You could find this online. And for this lesson, the fictional character that is used is Amelia Bedelia. I'm sure you're all familiar with this famously literal-minded maid. And in this story, Amelia Bedelia has been told by her employer to find the dress in her closet that has spots on it and get the spots out. And Amelia Bedelia, of course, finds a polka-dotted dress, and the only way she can figure to get the spots out is to cut them out with a pair of scissors. And this could be a very engaging lesson, but students only get one paragraph from that Amelia Bedelia book, and then they get comprehension questions that they need to answer. And, you know, this is very similar to what they would see on a standardized reading comprehension test. But is this actually the best way to introduce kids to the joy of reading? And is it necessary to teach them about the difference between literal and non-literal language? Couldn't they get the whole book and also learn about that? So making reading into this kind of chore and essentially test prep is possibly one reason that kids are not reading for pleasure anymore. But it's actually goes deeper than just too much test prep, although that has certainly exacerbated the problem. But the basic problem is the way we've been conceiving of reading comprehension for decades now as a set of sort of abstract strategies and skills that we can teach directly and that students can then apply generally. So often this is just one list I found online. There's a whole bunch of them, things like finding the main idea, making inferences. Often there's a skill of the week, and the teacher will model that skill briefly, 10 or 15 minute mini lesson, using a text chosen not for its content, but for how well it lends itself to modeling the skill of comparing and contrasting, or whatever the skill of the week is. And then the other part of this approach has kids practice the skill on books or texts that have been determined to be at their individual reading levels. And that could be well below their grade level, but they will be directed to a basket or shelf of books that matches their level. And again, these baskets, they're not, the books in them are not categorized by things like content, their topic, but by things like how long the sentences are, how commonly used are the words. And the theory behind this approach is that if kids diligently practice a skill like finding the main idea of a text, that they will master that skill and be able to apply it to find the main idea and gain knowledge from any text they try to read, whether it's a passage on an end of the year reading test or a textbook in Height Down the Road in high school or a newspaper article or whatever. If you're good at finding the main idea, you'll be able to find the main idea. So let's just quickly test out that theory. I'm just going to show you a paragraph from a newspaper. I'm sure you're all expert readers. So I'll ask you to find the main idea, and this should not be a challenge. And I'll give you a minute to read the paragraph. Now, I can't see your faces, but I'm assuming there's some blank looks out there. And what I didn't tell you is that I took this paragraph from a British newspaper. And as you may have guessed from the last word, wicket, this paragraph is actually describing part of a cricket match. And if you're a cricket fan, maybe, maybe there's some of you out there who are, you probably have no trouble understanding this paragraph. But if, like me, like most Americans, you don't know anything about cricket, you don't know what this paragraph is trying to tell you. And it's not that you can't decode the words. It's not that you don't understand the individual words, actually, but they just don't add up to anything comprehensible. So this is something that cognitive scientists who study reading comprehension have actually known about for a long time. Back in the late 1980s, a couple of researchers wanted to know what is more important in reading comprehension. Is it a general skill like finding the main idea, the kinds of skills that appear to be measured by standardized reading comprehension tests? Or is it how much the reader knows about the topic they're reading about? And this study, which some may have heard of, has come to be known as the baseball study. So they chose the topic of baseball because they figured they're doing this with 7th and 8th graders, and they figured there are probably lots of kids out there who are not generally good readers, but they do know a lot about baseball. So they took a bunch of kids, divided them into 4 groups, depending on how well they scored on a standardized reading comprehension test and how much they knew about baseball. And then they gave them all a passage to read describing half an inning of a baseball game and tested their comprehension of that passage. And what they found was what really made a difference was how much a kid knew about baseball. So these are the kids who scored low on the standardized reading comprehension test, but knew a lot about baseball. These are the kids who scored high on that standardized test, but did not know much about baseball. And as you can see, when the poor comprehenders knew a lot about the topic they were reading about, there was actually no problem with their comprehension. So this is not just one study. We have other studies like this and many studies showing that having knowledge of the topic you're reading about is very helpful to comprehension. And so what these studies tell us, a couple of things. First of all, comprehension skills, they're not skills like riding a bike or playing tennis or decoding words. They don't just get better with practice. Whether you can apply a skill like finding the main idea is actually going to depend to a large extent on how much knowledge you have relating to what you're reading about. Secondly, along with that, there's really no such thing as a fixed reading level because those measures don't take account of the topic and the reader's knowledge of the topic. So they're just approximations. And in fact, it's been found that they disagree with each other so much that it's kind of like flipping a coin. So this may be fairly obvious when we're talking about a topic like baseball or cricket or anything with its own lingo, like molecular biology. If you know the lingo, it's going to be easier to understand a text on that topic. What may be less obvious is how much we rely on our general background knowledge to understand everything we read. And that's particularly true of more academic kinds of knowledge, the kind of knowledge that tends to be assumed by more complex text. So, for example, it has been found that there's a very high correlation between knowing something like in what part of the body does pneumonia occur and general reading comprehension. And what that suggests is that instead of trying to boost comprehension by having kids practice these supposedly abstract skills day after day, year after year, what we really should be doing is giving them access to as much academic knowledge and vocabulary as possible. But that's not all. So we know that knowledge of the topic is helpful to comprehension. General academic knowledge and vocabulary is helpful to comprehension. But there's a third factor as well, because reading comprehension is really complicated, much more complicated than decoding, which we know is complicated. So in addition to those things, what's really helpful is familiarity with complex syntax, complex sentence structure, because the syntax of written language is almost always more complex than the syntax of oral language, the syntax we use in conversation. And so a kid could be a fine decoder, maybe even have good vocabulary, but if he or she is unfamiliar with the complex syntax of written language, that can be a significant barrier to comprehension. For example, I came across an article about a 10-year-old boy who had average decoding ability, but he struggled with comprehension. And the researcher in this study read the boy the following sentence: Rachel Carson, scientist, writer, and ecologist, grew up in the rural river town of Springdale, Pennsylvania. And then she asked the boy, "What do you know about Rachel Carson now?" And he replied, "They grew up together in the same place." Now, how did he get that answer? Well, it has to do with syntax. So this structure, that's called an appositive. It's a phrase describing a noun. It appears frequently in written text, but this isn't the way we talk. So being unfamiliar with this structure, this boy thought there were actually probably 4 people in this sentence: Rachel Carson, a scientist, a writer, and an ecologist, and they all work together. And you might think that's weird, but according to the authors of this study, it's really not uncommon for kids to seize upon the noun that's closest to the verb in a sentence and figure that that's the subject that goes with the verb, even though there may be many words in between. And lest you think this is uncommon, I came across another study, long-term, large-scale study, finding that fewer than 10% of 8th graders can evaluate complex syntax. So this is another significant barrier to comprehension that we're really not addressing with our approach to teaching it. So that general knowledge of vocabulary and complex syntax, that is the ultimate goal, because that general knowledge is what is going to help kids read and understand texts on topics they don't already know about and learn from those texts. But how do we help kids acquire that general knowledge? Really, the only way is to provide them with knowledge of lots of topics, because that general knowledge, vocabulary, syntax, it doesn't stick in the abstract. It needs a meaningful context for it to stick in long-term memory. Speaking of which, so what is going on in the mind that makes prior relevant knowledge so helpful to comprehension and also retention of information analysis? Well, it has to do with the way the mind takes in new information, the way we learn, and particularly that box, the middle box there labeled working memory. So that's the aspect of our consciousness where we are consciously trying to make sense of new information. And the important thing to know about working memory is it's very limited in its capacity. It can only juggle on average about 4 or 5 items of new information for about 20 seconds before it starts to become overwhelmed and we start to lose the ability to understand what we're trying to take in. And of course, if you're not yet a proficient reader, an additional burden on working memory is trying to decode, trying to figure out where the emphasis goes in a sentence. So that burden on working memory is called cognitive load. Cognitive scientists call it that. And too much cognitive load is going to interfere with comprehension. So unfortunately, there's no reliable way to expand any individual's working memory capacity, but there is a way around its limitations, and that has to do with that blue box labeled long-term memory, which is potentially infinite. So if we have prior relevant knowledge stored in long-term memory and we can just bring it up when we need it, we don't have to juggle that in working memory along with whatever new information we're trying to take in. So for example, if you're reading about baseball and you already know what a double play is, you don't have to think about that. You don't have to go off and look it up, which is also a heavy burden on working memory. You can just attend to the new information in what you're reading and absorb that. But there are a couple of tricks here. And one is we first need to transfer new information to long-term memory, and we also need to be able to retrieve it when we need it. So what helps with transfer is to attach meaning to the new information. And one really good way to do that is to talk about it, explain it to someone else in our own words. For retrieval, what helps is to practice retrieving an item of information. So the more you practice retrieving an item, the more likely you are to be able to get it when you need it. And there are different ways to engage in retrieval practice. Quizzing is one, but also it turns out that explaining the information to someone else in your own words is a very effective way of engaging in retrieval practice. So we'll come back to those ideas, but that's the basic cognitive architecture that explains why prior relevant knowledge is so helpful. So what does all this have to do with scores on reading tests, which is what got me looking into all of this in the first place? I wanted to know, as a journalist writing about education, why there was such a stubborn gap and quite wide gap in test scores, basically between kids at the upper and lower ends of the socioeconomic spectrum. Well, the passages on reading tests, like any written text, make certain assumptions about what readers already know. Writers don't explain every term they use because if they did, their writing would be quite tedious and no one would want to read it. And the passages on reading tests are designed to avoid topics that kids might have learned about in school. Because the idea is, well, we're not testing their content knowledge, we're actually just testing their comprehension skills, like finding the main idea. But if you don't have enough prior relevant knowledge to understand the passage on the test, at least at a superficial level, you're never going to get a chance to demonstrate your skill at making an inference or whatever the test purports to be measuring. These tests have actually been called knowledge tests in disguise. So to show you what that might look like in real life, I'm going to just show you a paragraph from a released item from a third grade standardized reading test. So I'll give you a minute to read that. So to us as educated adults, this paragraph might look pretty straightforward, but there are actually a number of words and phrases here that many third graders are unlikely to know. And for those kids, it's like trying to make sense of that cricket paragraph when you don't know anything about cricket. It's going to be very hard to find the main idea or whatever. Now, obviously, some third graders will know these words and phrases, or many of them, and they tend to be the third graders who've been able to pick up that kind of information outside of school, probably because they have more highly educated parents who may have more resources, who've read them books about the Inuit or taken them to museums or maybe even to Alaska. But the other kids, unless they happen to live in Alaska, they're going to rely on school for this kind of information. And unfortunately, in our current system, they're actually the least likely to get it there. So why is that? Well, it has to do with the way we allocate time in the elementary school day. So a quick quiz. On average, how much time do American elementary students spend each day on these subjects? Well, I won't keep you in suspense because the federal government has actually collected data on this, and they found, after looking at 7,000 elementary students, as reported by schools, the average amount of time spent on ELA each day is about 2 hours, about 80 minutes on math, and then, as reported by schools, about half an hour each on science and social studies every day. Now, I've been in a lot of schools and talked to a lot of educators, and I think that's an overestimate of how much time elementary students are getting on science and social studies every day. There may be time in the schedule, half an hour at the end of the day, 2 or 3 times a week for one of those subjects. But often, even that time ends up getting used for one of the tested subjects, ELA or math. And that's especially likely to happen in schools where test scores are low, which tend to be the schools serving kids from the less highly educated families. Who are least likely to pick up social studies information or whatever outside of school. And the theory here, which seems to make sense, is that, well, if we want to get those reading test scores up, we need to spend more time on reading. And a lot of that time will be practicing the skills that appear to be measured by standardized reading tests. But let's take a closer look at this data, as a couple of researchers did. They asked a couple of questions. One, they asked, what happens if kids get an extra half an hour a day of social studies beyond average? And they found that by fifth grade, that was correlated with higher reading test scores. They also asked, what happens if kids get an extra half an hour a day of reading, or ELA? And they found that was actually not correlated with higher reading test scores. Now, this study can't tell us why, but one likely explanation is that the kids who were getting more social studies were getting more of the knowledge and vocabulary that helped them understand the passages on the reading tests. And that conclusion is bolstered by a couple of additional findings. One, the kids from the lowest income families, they got the biggest boost from more social studies. The kids from the highest income families got no boost from more social studies, maybe because they already knew that vocabulary. Now, that doesn't mean that kids from rich families don't need social studies. All kids need social studies, but it does mean that in our well-intentioned effort to boost test scores for the most vulnerable students, that we've really been shooting ourselves in the foot. So this approach to teaching reading actually can have a negative impact on all children. Even if you're a good reader, it can be pretty boring to just practice finding the main idea or whatever day after day on books on random topics. But its negative impact falls hardest on certain subgroups of students. So kids who struggle with decoding, kids with less academic knowledge and vocabulary, and of course, many kids fall into both of those categories, especially at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. These are the kids who are going to be relegated to the low reading groups, limited to what they can read themselves, at least theoretically, and deprived of access to the very thing that could help them move up, academic knowledge and vocabulary. And to make matters worse, the situation gets worse as the years go by. Why would that be? Well, having prior relevant knowledge doesn't just help you understand what you're reading, it also helps you retain new information, new vocabulary from what you're reading. It's been said that knowledge is like mental Velcro. It sticks best to other related knowledge. So some kids are coming into school with more of that other half of the Velcro, more of that academic knowledge and vocabulary. In our leveled reading system, they're able to read more complex text, but they're also in a good position to retain new vocabulary, new information from those texts, because they may have something for it to stick to. And that in turn enables them to read yet more complex text. The other kids who are coming in with less of that other half of the Velcro are, first of all, probably limited to simpler texts. But even if there's some new vocabulary in those texts, they're probably not going to retain it because they don't have anything for it to stick to. And what this leads to is a growing gap between these two groups of readers. And by the time kids get to higher grade levels, to high school, this gap can be very large indeed and very difficult to narrow, which is why it is so important to start building knowledge early. In kindergarten, you're going to get a much bigger bang for your buck. But one problem is that at those lower grade levels, it can look like that skills and strategies approach to comprehension is working. But then it backfires when students reach upper grades. It can look like it's working at lower grade levels, basically because the texts we're asking kids to read often don't assume much academic knowledge and vocabulary. But then when they get to middle school and high school and the texts do start assuming that knowledge and vocabulary, if they don't have it, they're probably going to hit a wall. And there's another kind of knowledge gap that becomes obvious in high school, although it does not begin there. And that's the difference between what the curriculum assumes high school students know and what many of them actually do know. And this can be apparent at all socioeconomic levels, but it's most obvious at high poverty high schools. It's not uncommon for kids to not know some very basic things about the world because this narrow focus on reading and math can continue through middle school. So they may not know the difference between a city and a state or a country and a continent. They may not be able to find the United States on a map of the world or their hometown on a map of the United States, and they may not know anything about historical events or even have a sense of historical chronology. And it's not because they can't learn those things, it's because no one has taught them those things in a way that will stick. And yet, we give them textbooks like this and expect them to read and understand them. And that's going to be very frustrating if you're missing that much background knowledge, both for you and probably for your teacher as well. And of course, the tests at higher grade levels start assuming a lot more sophisticated knowledge and vocabulary and familiarity with complex syntax. So when I stumbled upon this problem, the lack of content in the elementary curriculum, our failure to start building academic knowledge early, I was really confused and surprised because I'd been writing about education as a journalist for several years. I thought I knew a lot about education. And I'd never heard about this as a problem. I'd been in elementary classrooms, but I realized I hadn't really understood what I was looking at. And I knew that I eventually found some people who were very concerned about this problem, a small group of people. I learned a lot from them, but I realized that they were essentially just talking to each other. It had been written about, but in kind of a dry academic way. So I thought, well, maybe if someone writes about this in a more journalistic, engaging way, that will help get this issue into the public conversation about education where it belongs. And so that's the book that I tried to write. And the book has been out now for 4.5 years or so. And as concerned as I was about this issue when I was researching and writing the book, I'm even more concerned now because we are still living with the legacy of remote and hybrid learning. And we know that the very same students who were not being well served by this system before the pandemic are the same ones who were the worst negative impact from remote and hybrid schooling. And test scores were stagnant or declining before the pandemic. The gap between good and poor readers or high and low scorers on tests like the NAEP was expanding before the pandemic. So we can't just go back to what we were doing before or just do more of it because it wasn't working before. But I didn't write the book just to describe the problem. I also wanted to know what we can do about it. And the good news is that there is a lot that teachers and schools can do to address these knowledge gaps. So let's start with what individual teachers can do. And I'm mostly talking here about elementary teachers. So several things. First, rather than having a skill of the week and choosing a text to teach the skill, jumping around from topic to topic, choose a topic and organize a series of read alouds that relate to that topic. So let's say sea mammals, spend 2-3 weeks maybe reading about sea mammals from using texts that are more complex than what kids could probably read on their own. So you want to spend some time on a topic and go fairly deeply into it, partly because it's probably going to be more interesting, but also because kids need to hear the same vocabulary, the same concepts repeatedly in somewhat different contexts for that information to stick in long-term memory. And you want to be reading more complex text than kids can read on their own, because we know that listening comprehension exceeds reading comprehension, actually on average through about age 13. So if it has to do again with working memory. So if someone else, before you're a proficient reader, if someone else is doing that work of decoding, of figuring out where the emphasis goes in a sentence, then that opens up more working memory capacity to take in new information. So this is the way to build knowledge of a new topic in the first instance. And then along with read alouds, and also, by the way, to help familiarize kids with that complex syntax of written language. But along with those read alouds, you want to have class discussion, and I'm talking whole class read alouds, whole class discussion, that put the content in the foreground rather than the skill. It's not that you have to choose between teaching comprehension skills and building knowledge. That's a false dichotomy. It's a question of what you put in the foreground. You want to put the content in the foreground and bring in whatever skill or strategy is helpful to enable kids to think about and understand the content. And I'll give an example of what that might look like in a few minutes. But for example, instead of saying, okay, we're learning about inferences this week and who can make an inference about what we just read, ask a question about the content that implicitly requires kids to make an inference. And then classroom libraries, rather than having them just organized by reading level, also have them organized by topic, especially a topic that you've spent 2 or 3 weeks learning about through read alouds and discussion. So if you've been reading aloud and talking about sea mammals, have a basket of books out about sea mammals at different levels of difficulty. Because remember the baseball study. Once kids have background knowledge of a topic, and here they will have some background knowledge built through read alouds and discussion, they're liable to be able to read about that topic at a higher level. And you might see on the bottom shelf in this picture that there are some baskets that are organized by topic, but the topics are very broad, like animals, plants, or just nonfiction. Just because you've learned vocabulary relating to sea mammals doesn't mean you're going to be able to read and understand a book on reptiles. So they need to be fairly specific. And then fourth, spend lots of time on meaty social studies and science topics. Of course, fiction and poetry have their place in the elementary classroom, but we've been giving very short shrift to social studies and science. And it does seem that those kinds of topics have the most potential to build the vocabulary, the knowledge that fuels reading comprehension. And then lastly, I'll be talking more about writing in a few minutes, but I'll just say for now, have students write about what they're learning. We know from multiple studies that when students write about what they're learning, any subject, any grade level, it boosts their learning. It helps them with comprehension and retention. But there's going to be a limit to what any individual teacher can do to really address these knowledge gaps, because building knowledge is a gradual, cumulative process that extends across grade levels and across school years, and no individual teacher controls what happens at other grade levels. So someone at a higher level will need to step in for us to make real progress here. So what can they do? Well, a crucial step is to adopt a different kind of literacy curriculum, one that goes deeply into topics in social studies, science, and the arts, including literature. And the good news is there are now several different, maybe 6 or 7 different literacy curricula that do this. They all cover different bodies of knowledge in different ways, so there are choices, but they all have some crucial things in common. And one is that they are organized by topic rather than skill of the week. And they spend at least 2-3 weeks, sometimes more, on a topic. Also, they give all students in the classroom, regardless of their individual decoding ability, access to complex grade level or above text. They also connect the various aspects of literacy in a way that enables students to read and write at a higher level. So we have to remember, of course, that there is more to literacy than reading, and even more than reading and writing. There's also listening and speaking. But listening and speaking are different from reading and writing in a crucial way. They are easier. We don't have to teach kids to do those things. We have evolved as human beings to do those things naturally. And what that means is that in themselves, listening and speaking don't impose a burden on working memory. This is why listening comprehension, reading comprehension for so long. So this is going to be the way to build knowledge of a new topic in the first instance. And then once kids have that knowledge, they can read and write about that topic at a higher level. So this only works, though, if they're reading and writing about the same topic they've been listening to and speaking about. And in the standard, the usual approach to reading comprehension, that's not what happens. They might be listening to a text on sea mammals, but the focus of discussion might be determining the author's purpose. And then they might go off to try to practice that skill on a text on a completely different topic, like the solar system or whatever, that they might not know anything about. And then they might be asked to write about yet a different topic that they might not know much about. So we've just been making reading and writing harder than they need to be. But an effective knowledge building curriculum will have students reading and writing about the same topics they've been listening to and speaking. Another way of looking at this is that literacy is going to develop along 2 separate pathways that will ultimately come together. So on the one hand, kids will be acquiring those foundational skills through decodable texts and maybe fluency practice. This is not probably the way they're going to be acquiring new knowledge of a topic in the first instance. That will come through this other pathway: read alouds, class discussion. And then when their foundational skills catch up to where their background knowledge is, those foundational skills will kick in to enable them to read and write about a range of topics at a higher level. And what about that problem about kids not reading for fun anymore? Well, a knowledge building elementary curriculum can also help with that. So this is an article I wrote some years ago about a teacher in Tennessee, a 3rd grade teacher, Dolores Fowler. And Dolores had been asked by her district to pilot a new curriculum. It was a knowledge building elementary curriculum. And Dolores was a veteran teacher. She'd seen a lot of trends come and go, and she was deeply skeptical about this new curriculum, which was called Core Knowledge Language Arts, or CKLA. She looked at the topics in 3rd grade and she thought, why would my kids be interested in these things? The Vikings, ancient Rome? Well, they're not going to care about that stuff. Well, she quickly found she was wrong about that. They were really interested in those topics that they were learning about through read alouds and discussion. And then when I interviewed her again for a podcast I hosted last year, she told me that the librarian at her school came to her, had to order more books. She actually came to me and said, what are the topics you're teaching in CKLA? Because I want to order more books, because the kids are asking for these books on these topics. And this is something I've heard from several teachers and school librarians repeatedly. When you introduce kids to a topic in an engaging way through read alouds and discussion, they want to read more about that topic. Or it could be an author. They want to read more books by that author. So this is the way to really spark an interest in reading and a recognition that reading can be a source of pleasure and as well as knowledge. So we do have some recent evidence that knowledge building curricula can boost comprehension. As I said, we've long had evidence that having knowledge of the topic you're reading about helps with comprehension. It's harder to get evidence that building kids' knowledge through a knowledge building curriculum covers a range of topics can boost comprehension as measured by standardized tests, because those standardized tests are not tied to any particular body of knowledge. So your kids might know a lot about the Vikings in ancient Rome, but they get to the test and the passage is about the Inuit, and they may not yet have that critical mass of general academic knowledge that's going to enable them to read and understand texts on topics they don't already know about. But we are beginning to get some evidence that this happens after a while. So this study was done of a curriculum called Bookworms, which is a knowledge building curriculum, K through 5, that was developed by Sharon Walpole, who's a reading researcher. She's at the University of Delaware. So this study was quite large, followed 8,800 students over 3 years. And the majority of students in this sample were from low-income families. And this curriculum, it's unusual that it exposes students to a lot of full-length books, over 250 between kindergarten and 5th grade, and also provides instruction in foundational reading skills. And what they found in the study was that the gains, as you would expect, compounded over time. So the longer kids got this curriculum, the better their scores were on standardized reading tests. So by the end of 5th grade, the effect size on standardized reading tests was 0.26. That's very large in the education context. So this is really, I would say this curriculum has probably more evidence behind it than any of the others. And as you would expect, the weakest students benefited the most. Probably the ones who were not as able to acquire this kind of knowledge from just by happenstance. So that is an encouraging study. And there are others out there that are showing that it could take a few years for this to show up, but it does really make a difference to general reading comprehension. So if you're looking for guidance in identifying effective knowledge building curricula, one resource you might want to look at is the website of the Knowledge Matters campaign. They have curriculum experts who've identified now 8 curricula that do a good job of building knowledge. One of them is just middle school, and 7 either are just elementary or cover K through 8. And they also have developed a review tool that you can use to determine whether the curriculum you're using or considering is actually effective at building knowledge. Because unfortunately, we now do have some curricula that are labeled knowledge building that actually don't do a really effective job of building the kind of knowledge that fuels comprehension. And another resource you might want to look at is the Reading League. They've recently started releasing reports on curricula. They are so far just a few, but they do rate them for both foundational skills and knowledge building. But just briefly, how can you tell if a curriculum builds knowledge effectively? What are the warning signs to look out for? So one problem could be too much material included. You can't get through all of that in 1 year. There might be some good stuff in there, but there might also be some fluff, and it might not be that easy to figure out which is which. Thin content or themes rather than topics. So a theme might be something like, there could be good themes, but if it's a superficial, broad theme like friendship around the world, it's probably not going to give kids enough repeated exposure to the same vocabulary and concepts to enable those things to stick in long-term memory. It's probably also not going to be that interesting. Introducing new information without providing enough background knowledge through the curriculum. Putting skills and strategies in the foreground rather than content, relying too much on level text. And some independent, reading and level text is fine, but it shouldn't be the centerpiece of the curriculum. Writing assignments or activities that are not linked to the content in the curriculum, and using excerpts rather than whole texts, which can actually make it harder to gain knowledge from them. So those are some things to watch out for. And before I talk for a few minutes about writing, I'd like to tell you about a couple of early elementary classrooms I followed through a school year when I was researching my book, The Knowledge Gap. And the idea was to compare one classroom using the standard skills-focused approach to comprehension with another that was using one of the more recently developed knowledge building curricula. And this was so long ago, there was actually only one knowledge building curriculum available, and that was CKLA. And so, of course, these 2 classrooms were not identical, but they were one was 1st grade, one was 2nd grade, but they were pretty similar. All of the students in both classrooms came from low-income families. They were all children of color. And the teachers in both of these classrooms were hardworking, dedicated, good teachers. But what was going on within these classrooms was like they were on different planets. And the main reason for that, I think, was the curriculum, was what the teacher had been asked to teach. So I don't have video to show you, but I do have pictures I took of anchor charts in each of these classrooms. And this is a typical one from the skills-focused classroom. All of the posters and all of the instruction was focused on skills. And it was really hard for the teacher to get a discussion going because these were 6-year-olds. They just didn't have much to say about the difference between a caption and a subtitle. They wanted to know what was going on in the picture, but the teacher, with the best of intentions, felt that that wasn't what she should be focusing on. She should be focusing on getting them to distinguish between captions and subtitles. The other classroom was full of anchor charts that looked like this, full of content. This one is from a 2nd grade unit on Greek myths, and this is on the myth of Daedalus and Icarus. And the kids in this classroom were highly engaged. They loved Greek myths. They also loved the War of 1812. I think we really underestimate what kids can get interested in. And they often did not want the read aloud to end. They still had their hands up with comments and questions when it was time for discussion to end. And they were having really thoughtful discussions, more thoughtful than you might expect from 2nd graders. And they were using some pretty sophisticated vocabulary. So the vocabulary words on this particular day, all of them drawn from the read aloud: desperately, plummeted, and foresight. Now, these kids are not going to see those words on a 3rd or 4th grade reading comprehension test, but they will be expected to know these words down the road in high school. And by the way, most of the kids in this classroom were from non-English speaking families, but they were using these words and they understood these words. And these words will be there to help them in years to come in long-term memory. They're going to remember them because they've been using them and they've been encountering them in a meaningful, vivid context. Like this word plummeted shows up at the bottom here. Icarus's wings melted and he plummeted into the sea. I'd also like to point out this, it could look like this teacher's teaching comprehension skills because she's got this thing predict and these boxes labeled cause and effect. But this is the difference between putting skills in the foreground and content in the foreground. She's not trying to teach the skill of determining cause and effect and using a text to teach the skill. She's bringing in that skill because it's going to help students think about this text and this topic. And she's not just saying, can you make a prediction? She's asking, what is Daedalus's plan? A question about the content that implicitly requires kids to make a prediction. And that's what works. So a few minutes about, before I get to writing, what if you're teaching at higher grade levels? And the problem there is not so much that there's no content in the curriculum, but that students aren't equipped to access it at the level the curriculum expects. So don't despair. There are things you can do. It's more difficult to make up for knowledge gaps at higher grade levels, but it's not impossible. Read alouds can help. They shouldn't substitute for kids reading, but if it's a difficult text, maybe a read aloud first, the teacher reading aloud first, and then when students are familiar with the text, they may be able to do a better job of reading it on their own or with a partner. Teaching morphology can help, the suffixes and prefixes of words and etymology, the roots of words. Also writing instruction, which I'm going to talk about shortly, it can make a huge difference even at higher grade levels. Another factor, as I mentioned before, may be that students are struggling to decode those multisyllabic words that they encounter at higher grade levels. And I recently came across something called Readable English, which is essentially software that can be used to convert any text to a more readable version with certain symbols to indicate how vowels pronounced and silent letters grayed out. So that is something you might want to consider. But now, moving on to writing for a few minutes. So writing is not just a vital skill in and of itself, and we don't really pay enough attention to that, but it can also potentially be an extremely powerful lever for building and deepening and reinforcing the kind of knowledge that fuels comprehension and learning. So why is that? Well, as I mentioned, transfer and retrieval are really important. And for both of those things, what really helps is to explain the information to someone else in your own words. And that's what we do when we write. So writing helps with both of those processes. And that, I think, is the secret of its potential power. The problem is it's also the hardest thing I would say we ask students to do. It's much harder than reading. And we know reading is not that easy. And again, that has to do with the burden on working memory. If you're an inexperienced writer, you may be juggling everything from letter formation if you're young or come from a different alphabetic system, to spelling, to what words to use, organizing your thoughts, understanding the content you're writing about, maybe trying to use that more sophisticated syntax and vocabulary of written language. And all of this creates not only cognitive load, but also stress, which is itself a burden on working memory. So the bottom line here is that when we ask kids to write, especially if we ask them to write at length, they can easily get overwhelmed, and then they don't get those knowledge deepening benefits of writing. And they also probably don't learn to write well. And curricula and standards often have really unrealistic writing expectations, and that includes some knowledge building curricula. So this is a writing prompt I saw recently that was in a knowledge building curriculum. How are animals an important part of the plant's life cycle? Give 2 to 3 specific examples. And this was a kindergarten writing prompt. Now, I'm sure that these kids had something to say, but trying to say it on paper rather than orally was just overwhelming. And this school, they were doing this with the best of intentions, but I think, like many of us adults, we underestimate how difficult writing is for children, and actually for kids at higher grade levels as well, if they haven't been explicitly taught how to write beginning at the sentence level. So that leads me to writing instruction has enormous potential power, but we have not unlocked it because we've underestimated how hard it is. And we've also tried to teach it in isolation from content, a separate writing curriculum, or writing about personal experience. So we're not using it to deepen the knowledge that we want kids to retain. So what can we do? Well, 3 things. We need to modulate that heavy cognitive load. And that could mean starting at the sentence level, if that's what students need, no matter what grade level they're in. And teaching grammar and conventions of written language in the context of students' own writing, which is probably the only thing that will work for many students. And again, starting at the sentence level helps with that, because if you've got 5 pages of error-filled prose, it's hard to know where to begin. And then lastly, embedding writing activities in the content of the curriculum as soon as possible. And I know of only one method that combines all 3 of these principles, and that's the writing revolution. So it's not my method. I'm the co-author of this book. And by the way, a second edition is coming out in a few weeks. But the method was created by my co-author, Judith Hochman, who is a veteran educator and developed this over many years, really through trial and error. So I don't have time to really go deeply into the method, but I'd like to give you an idea of how it works. So one of the sentence level activities is called Because, But, and So. And what this consists of is giving students a sentence stem and having them complete it with each of these conjunctions. Now, the writing revolution is not a curriculum with its own content. It's a method that's designed to be adapted to whatever content you're teaching, any grade level or any subject matter. Let's say you're teaching about ancient India. You could give students the following stem. A civilization could form in the Indus River Valley because, but, and so. And each of these conjunctions requires students to retrieve, they already have to have the information, but to retrieve information from long-term memory, different kind of information in each case, and put it in their own words. But is going to be more difficult than because it's asking for contrasting information. And at the same time, these students will be learning how to use these conjunctions, even these simple conjunctions. Not all kids just pick that up from reading and their own writing, just writing at length. So there are different possible responses, but I'll just show you a few. And as you can see, this is a great way to reinforce new vocabulary. This is not just for ELA or social studies. This is really designed to be done across the curriculum, including in math class. So let's say you're teaching about fractions and decimals. You could use that same activity. Fractions are like decimals because, but, and so. And a math teacher might feel that they don't want to take time away from the math instruction to teach writing. But once they try this, they see it's actually reinforcing their math instruction because it's really getting kids to grapple with these concepts. And sentence level activities can also help in a very powerful way familiarize students with that complex syntax of written language while simultaneously reinforcing knowledge. So remember the boy who thought there were 4 different people in this sentence. So what can we do? Well, first, teach students what an appositive is. And you want to do that using familiar content so it doesn't overload working memory with new content as well as a new grammatical concept at the same time. But once they've got the idea of an appositive and they know something about Rachel Carson, you can give them this sentence to complete where they have to supply the appositive. So not only are they learning about appositives, they're also retrieving that information from long-term memory, putting it in their words. And these activities can, as I mentioned, be adapted for any grade level. If you've got young children or English language learners, you could do this as this kind of thing as a whole class oral activity. And actually, when you're introducing a new grammatical concept or concept of a new strategy, writing strategy, it is best to introduce it orally to the whole class at any grade level. But let's say you're teaching kindergartners about sound waves. You could say as a teacher, you can't see sound waves because, and the kids could supply, they are invisible. You can't see sound waves, but you can hear them. And this is laying the groundwork for later independent writing. So the method does go beyond sentences all the way through argumentative essays, but it is that sentence level work that lays the foundation for independent writing, along with teaching kids explicitly how to construct clear linear outlines for paragraphs and essays. And that's important because even if you know how to construct a sentence, writing at length imposes a heavy cognitive load of its own. You have to juggle in working memory with what was I going to say next? Or did I already say that? But if you have an outline that serves as a kind of roadmap that offloads some of that cognitive burden, plus merely creating an outline, even if you never turn it into a finished piece of writing, is a powerful knowledge reinforcing activity. So to show you, well, I'm not going to show you, I don't have time to show you how that works. Take my word for it. But effective writing instruction can turbocharge any content-rich curriculum, but if you're focusing on skills and you're jumping from topic to topic, it's probably not going to work because kids are not going to be able to acquire enough information about any one topic to enable them to write coherently. So, and if you've got a curriculum that's thin on content, doing this kind of writing activity can clue you into where you need to reinforce that curriculum with some additional content. And if the curriculum doesn't simultaneously build knowledge and writing ability along with foundational skills, so we can't just focus on problems with foundational skills instruction. What's going to happen if we just fix the phonics part is that kids are likely to arrive at higher grade levels, able to understand, able to decode complex text, but not able to understand it. And at that point, the pendulum could swing away from phonics once again, because in the past, when that's happened, people have said, well, you see, they can decode this text, but they can't understand it. So that means phonics doesn't work. Well, of course, phonics does work, but it's not enough. And neither actually is it just simply adopting an effective knowledge building curriculum. It's crucial, but because this is going to be so unfamiliar to most teachers, there could be some obstacles in the way of effective implementation. And one of those obstacles, as I mentioned, could be standardized testing, because if kids, you may not see immediate results on standardized tests for the reasons I mentioned before, but it doesn't mean that the knowledge building curriculum isn't working. It might just mean it's going to take more time. We now have evidence that it can take maybe 3 years for the effects of a knowledge building curriculum to show up on standardized tests. I won't go into detail on this study because I don't really have time, but this was a study of a curriculum called Model of Reading Engagement, which is a science-focused curriculum created by Jimmy Kim at Harvard. And in this randomized controlled trial, these kids got 3 years of a spiraling curriculum, so it built knowledge in a logical sequence. And the goal was to help students to connect new learning to this general schema. So they got these topics in first grade, then second grade, then third grade. And they were also getting assessments that to test their reading comprehension. So some of the passages were near transfer, some were mid transfer. That means they were using familiar vocabulary. Some were far transfer, unfamiliar vocabulary the kids had not actually learned. And they found there were no far transfer effects until the end of third grade. And at that point, they found pretty good effect sizes, including in math. So And the control group was also getting a content-rich ELA curriculum. So these effect sizes could have been larger if there had been more of a difference between the two groups. But the point is that standardized reading comprehension tests are all FAR transfer, right? They're not giving kids necessarily topics they're familiar with. So it took 3 years for those effects to show up. So other possible obstacles to effective implementation of a knowledge building curriculum, as I mentioned, this is very likely to be unfamiliar to most teachers. And so there could be intellectual obstacles, because not only is this unfamiliar, what I'm saying could contradict a lot of what teachers have heard during their training and after. It's not important for kids to retain factual information. It's more important to focus on skills like critical thinking or whatever. So it's natural to be skeptical of a message that contradicts everything you've ever heard. And then there could be emotional obstacles, because if you've been teaching in a certain way for years in the good faith belief that you are helping kids and someone comes along and casts doubt on that, that's a very difficult and painful message to take in. And all of us naturally raise barriers to taking in that painful message. And then lastly, there could be behavioral obstacles of habit. Because even if teaching is such a complex activity that even if you want to change what you're doing in the classroom, it can be hard to remember in the moment to do that. So none of these obstacles are insurmountable. Teachers are overcoming them as we speak, but they may need some support in order to do that. So what do they need? Well, first of all, they need to know why they're being asked to do things differently, because change is hard. If you don't understand why it's necessary, you might not do it. They also need the curriculum, the instructional material, so that they don't need to invent the wheel before class every night, maybe on Teachers Pay Teachers. And then they need the how best to deliver this particular curriculum for your particular students. And that kind of support should be ongoing, maybe coaching, maybe collaboration among teachers. And this is happening across the country as we speak. Teachers are getting this kind of support and they are changing what they're doing. And even the mainstream media is beginning to take some notice. So this was an article that appeared in the Louisville Courier Journal back in 2022. This reporter went to a high poverty rural district in Kentucky that had changed its approach to phonics instruction, but realized their kids needed more. So they adopted a knowledge building curriculum. And as in many such situations, the teachers were skeptical. They thought it was going to be too hard for their students. But what they found was actually the kids really liked this curriculum. They liked being challenged, and it was their favorite part of the day. And that's something I've heard over and over again from educators who've made this switch. We have really underestimated what kids can do. And I'd just like to close with an anecdote that to me illustrates the power of a knowledge building curriculum, not just to boost student achievement, as important as that is, but also to change expectations. So I heard this story when I was in Reno, Nevada, about a second grade teacher whose school had recently switched to a knowledge building curriculum, but they were still doing leveled reading. So she was giving one of her students a test to determine his individual reading level. And this was a little boy who struggled like crazy with reading. And the teacher saw in the testing kit, there was a text on the topic of westward expansion. And that happened to be the topic the class had just spent 2 or 3 weeks learning about through read-alouds and discussion. But that text was at a 4th grade reading level, and this was a struggling 2nd grade reader. Just out of curiosity, the teacher handed the text to the boy to see what he could do with it. And to her surprise, he read it with 98% accuracy and 100% comprehension. And I think that experience changed the teacher's idea of who that little boy was and what he was capable of doing. And it probably changed that little boy's idea of who he was as well. And that is one reason I feel so much urgency about this topic. We have, with the best of intentions, made untold numbers of children feel like they are failures, when in fact it's the system that's failed them. So thank you very much. There's some information about, contact me through my website, but I'm also happy to take questions now. So I will